Hey everyone, welcome to the podcast. My name is Jeffrey and I'll be your host. Today's topic, we are doing another round of 5 common historical myths that you hear at historic sites and museums. So just like the first round, we're just going to go through 5 myths that we hear a lot at the Stephenson house, and other sites probably hear them too. But most of these are false, and I'm going to try and explain some of the reasons why these 5 common myths are false. So our first myth is kind of a combo myth, and it has to deal with corsets and removing lower ribs for your corsets. There's a common myth that women wore a corset to shrink their waist. Almost every single tour that I give or that I'm on at the Stephenson House has to talk about this myth. We have a mannequin in our children's bedroom that displays a corset and some of the other undergarments that a woman would wear during our time period. We have other types of corsets on the girl's bed as well as on the mannequin, so guests can see different types. I always try and explain that every woman wore a corset during the federal period. Usually when I say that, people on the tour, usually women, give a grimace or they're like, "Ugh, that sounds terrible." But they always think about how Hollywood has changed what our viewpoint of the corset is. They all think about the movies and how women in those movies wear their corsets where they're super cinched up and they can't breathe. But that's really not the case, especially for our period. I try and remind them that in the federal period, the fashionable waistline was not where it is now, nor was it where it is when they see those movies. The waistline is completely different. It's much further up the torso, and corsets were used not to shrink a waistline, but for other reasons. One of the main reasons was for back support for women who worked. If you're working in a kitchen or outside doing heavy lifting or manual labor, that corset's going to help support your back from hurting. When we're out in our kitchen, when we're lifting those cast iron pots and pans and ovens, it's much better to have a corset on than it is just to strain your back. When we do our laundry demonstration, when a bunch of the women dress as a laundress, it makes sense to have a corset on because they're lifting those heavy wash bins and they're running back and forth with water as well. So it helps for those working ladies who really need the extra support for their back. Another reason was for posture. Posture was super important during this period, and corsets helped women keep good posture because it makes them move their shoulders back, and there's usually a wooden busk in their corset that makes them sit up straight. And so they can't really sit and slouch back in any chair. They're usually sitting on the edge, especially with chairs that have backs that are further back. Women usually have to sit on the edge of a chair. Going into the removal of lower ribs to get a smaller waist. This is complete nonsense because most medicine during this time frame was not that great. And even in the trend of the waistline was to be slim, this technique of removing ribs would have been underwhelming. They don't have the technology. As I said, medicine was not up to speed with this practice. Most doctors were still using herbal medicines and rudimentary techniques to even treat their patients who didn't undergo a severe surgery to remove ribs. There's also hardly any or no anesthesia for operations like that. So most likely the patient would feel every single ounce of pain when the doctor opens them up to the time that they would close them back up after removing the lower ribs. And most doctors during this time frame probably wouldn't even agree to do such a surgery for just aesthetic reasons. They would be more concerned about the patient's survival rate after that I don't think most doctors would even have the heart to even do that type of removal unless it was absolutely necessary. And even then, they probably wouldn't even want to try. So that is our first myth about the corset and removing the lower ribs. Our second myth is that guns were heavy and awkward to fire. Whenever we give tours at the Stephenson house, we usually have one or two muskets on display that guests can usually see. One of our muskets is a bit taller than the other. The taller one is our military musket. The other one is just your standard ordinary musket. Neither one is overly heavy really, but where the problem comes in for visitors when they see them is that they aren't used to holding a musket. A musket's usually longer than your standard guns now, but they're not used to the system of firing either. We still use a flint and lock system where the gunpowder must be poured down the barrel along with the musket ball, and then you'll use your ramrod to ram the musket ball closer down to where the trigger and the pan are. And then you'll have to put more powder in the pan that's closer to the trigger, and then you'll be able to fire your weapon once you pull the trigger. Many of the early weapons that we use during our time frame have about the same weight as the U.S. World War II rifle, the M1 Garand. That's your standard weapon that you'll see in the U.S. military during World War II. And most muskets are about the same as the M1 Garand. Many of the early weapons had weights between 6 and 10 pounds, and the M1 Garand weighs about 9.5 pounds. So if you're a World War II vet, you probably wouldn't think that the military musket or the ordinary musket would be any heavier than the M1 Garand that they would be carrying. Where people get bogged down is where it's the process to fire the musket. On average, it takes about 30 seconds to fire and reload a musket. That's with the training that you would have with it. If you weren't trained, it probably will take you longer until you get used to that reloading and firing process. If you had a rifle during this time, rifles took about 1 minute to fire and reload, just because they have that rifling engrooved in the barrel, so it takes just a little bit longer to ram the musket ball down the barrel. So that is our second myth for this podcast. Our third myth is double staircases on larger homes. I've been on several tours where I've heard this myth, so let's kind of debunk why we have these double staircases. The myth states that they had double staircases because men were to use one side and the women use the other side. With men and women using two different staircases, the men wouldn't see the women's ankles. So that was the reason that they believe that we have these double staircases. Well, obviously that myth is wrong. And I've heard this myth on a few tours at different sites I've been to, and it usually gets good reactions from visitors because they always think that our ancestors were very prudish, and so they usually like those type of myth. The real purpose of the double staircases was not to hide the women's ankles, obviously. There are a couple of reasons for these two staircases. The first is that the servants used one set of stairs for housework, bringing supplies to hosts and bringing food to get a guest. Sometimes this set of staircases was in worse shape because of the constant use. So that's one possible reason to use the two set of staircases, where the owners and the guests would use one side and then the servants and workers would use the other side. Another reason for the use of double staircases was more just to show off. Having additional staircases showed off your wealth and your status. Most people love to show off for their friends and other visitors, and a double staircase definitely shows your wealth because it takes time and money and wood and supplies just to build the double staircase. So just having one shows that you have a higher status than someone else. The last reason for double staircases is the style of the home. These type of staircases were often seen in French homes or people that liked the French styles. One example I can think of with a double staircase in our region is the Pierre Menard home down near Chester. Menard was of French descent, and I'm sure his heritage influenced the style of his home and his furnishings. The Menard home's double staircase was on the outside of the house, but it was also common to have double staircases on the inside of the home too. But our area has a deep French heritage, so it makes sense to have more homes that have a French style, because the French were some of the first people who were Europeans to come to this region. Our fourth myth is cooks used spices to mask the odor of rotting meat. I think I talked about this myth during our kitchen podcast. For a long time, spices were only available to the wealthy. They had to be imported from the Dutch Indies. On the Illinois frontier, people could get spices, but the East Coast probably got them more often. Spices would either have to travel over land through the Ohio Valley or through the Cumberland Gap. They would have also used the Mississippi River from New Orleans to St. Louis to get some of their spice trade. If only the wealthy could afford an abundance of spices, they could afford meat that wasn't rotting as well. Our ancestors were not stupid enough to eat rotting meat even if they needed it. And to use spices was to be a luxury item. People who could afford luxury items could afford luxury meat products as well. So they're not going to be eating spoiled or rotten anything when they can afford to buy new stuff. One of the most used spices in the area was nutmeg. Families had access to sugar as well, but it came in a cone shape and you had to use nippers to break off pieces of the sugar. Again, most people, even if they couldn't afford the spices, are smart enough not to eat rotting meat. It would have serious health repercussions that they would eat anything that was spoiled, and they would know that. We're not the only ones that realized that. We had to learn it from somewhere. So our ancestors realized that rotting meat is not the best thing to eat, and spices were used sparsely to help some of your foods. And as I mentioned, nutmeg was the most used spice during this time, along with sugar. Our last myth for this podcast is shoe rotation. This myth deals with how people wore their shoes. Shoes were typically made straighter. Rotating a shoe like tires would not make them wear down the same, is what the thought is. But the shoe rotation doesn't make sense, because when a person wore their shoes for the first time, the shoe would conform to that person's foot and way of walking pretty quick. After a little time of wearing, it can clearly be seen which shoe was put on the right foot versus the left foot. It would be very uncomfortable for someone to switch their shoes back and forth, especially after it would start to conform to their left or right foot. I personally would not want to switch my period shoes back and forth with all of the standing and walking that I would do in those shoes. When I first bought my period shoes, after about a few days, you could clearly tell which foot went in which shoe. It's not rocket science, really. I'm sure other folks feel the same way as I do when wearing period shoes. It just wouldn't make sense to have that shoe rotation, because your foot would have serious problems after wearing it back and forth after just a few days. So that myth really just sounds painful to me personally. So that brings us to the end of our fifth myth for this podcast. I hope when you hear these myths at historic sites and museums, you remember they are just myths and not actual facts. Well, I hope you all are staying safe and healthy during this COVID spread, and I hope to see you all next time.